Those of you who are joining us online to the 2023 Tipple Lecture at the Theological School here at Drew University. My name is Edwin Aponte. I am the relatively new dean here at Drew Theological School. And it's my pleasure not only to welcome you to the Tipple Lecture this year, but also to introduce our speaker, our lecturer. Dr. Ashley Boggan is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History of the United Methodist Church. Dr. Boggan earned her PhD from Drew's Graduate Division of Religion in 2017, and we are proud about that. She specialized in both Methodist Wesleyan studies and women's gender studies. Prior to becoming General Secretary, she also worked as staff at General Commission on Archives and History and at the Connection Note Table of the United Methodist Church. Dr. Boggan is a lay member of the Arkansas Annual Conference and the daughter of two ordained United Methodist ministers. But her Methodist lineage even goes back further to the 19th century when her great-great-great-grandfathers were Methodist circuit riders. I think she knows her stuff. She is the author of Nevertheless, American Methodists and Women's Rights, and Entangled, A History of American Methodism, Politics, and Sexuality. She will be talking to us tonight about foundations of our past. Dr. Boggan.
Thank you, Dean Aponte. And thank you, Drew Theological School, for inviting me to give a talk to you all this evening. Welcome to everybody attending here in person and to those of you online. I want to start by offering a slightly friendly amendment to my own title of my talk. I want to call this talk Vile Foundations of Our Past. Vile. That word has been with me these past few months, and I'm sure that my staff and board members and maybe some few friends here are probably rolling their eyes with, good Lord, here she goes again with that vile thing. But stick with me for 30 minutes, and I promise, or I at least hope, that by the end of this talk, you'll see why I've sought to be more vile of late and encourage others to be more vile with me. In this talk, I'll walk through the different phases of what I'm calling Wesleyan or Methodist vitality. We'll start with John Wesley and his submitting to be more vile in Bristol. Then we'll look at the Methodist Episcopal Church and its institutional loss of vitality. Finally, we'll examine how caucuses were primarily responsible for carrying the Wesleyan message of dissent or vitality forward. Now, this past summer, I had the immense pleasure to be a part of the Wesleyan pilgrimage. My fellow pilgrims and I toured the major British sites of our Wesleyan heritage, from John Wesley's birthplace in Epworth to his chapel and home in London, to Oxford, where the Holy Club became ridiculed as Methodists. But the city that had the most meaning for me was Bristol. Bristol is a seaport town, and in Wesley's day, it was an important port of the Atlantic slave trade. Bristol was the second largest city in England, aside from London. It was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, producing everything from soap to chocolate to cannons. Coal mines surrounded it. And it was massively overcrowded. Its population was around 40,000 persons when its medieval walls were only meant to contain 5,000. There was no sanitation system, and it was widely known as the dirtiest town in all of England. It also had a massive divide between the rich and the poor. A select few families owned most of the industry, and most of the population worked for them for pennies. In this city, John established his first preaching house for the people called Methodist, the first official Methodist building in the world. Known as the New Room, this building stands in the heart of the modern-day city center. In Wesley's day, the ports where people were traded alongside goods would have been visible from its front doors. John came to Bristol in 1739 at the request of his frenemy, George Whitefield. And he quickly saw the need in this town for his unique message of God's all-embracing and assuring love. Within the first year, he built the New Room to serve as a meeting house, medical dispensary, a schoolroom, and a home for traveling preachers. It is also the space that John most likely called home, as he spent more nights and days here than anywhere else on his circuit. But these are not the reasons that Bristol will forever be marked on my heart. The director of global relationships at John Wesley's New Room is David Worthington. He gave an inspiring message about John's arrival in Bristol, one that we might say strangely warmed my heart. Now, as I mentioned, George Whitefield had been in Bristol for a while, preaching in the fields to ever-increasing crowds, and he needed assistance. So he reached out to his Oxford Don and also fellow frenemy John to come and join him. John arrived in Bristol on Saturday, March 31st, 1739. He had been in London, employed by the Fetter Lane Society and a few other smaller societies, when he received the request from Whitefield. John, being John, ran it by his brother Charles, who had been to Bristol before. And Charles warns him not to go, but John goes anyway. The day after his arrival, John sees Whitefield preach for the first time in the fields of Bristol. And he writes, "I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields." Now, at least for me, when I think of Methodism, especially Methodist historically, I tend to go directly to preaching in the fields, to camp meetings, to revivals, to John preaching atop his father's grave. But those are all moments that happen after Bristol. Up until this point, John, in his own words, says, quote, "I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if not done inside the walls of a church." In his journal, which is intended to be a public document, John sets up this dichotomy for us readers. He calls field preaching strange and admits that the only decent way to save souls is within the walls of a church. John, being a scripturally centered person, spends the rest of that afternoon wrestling with Scripture. And he finds himself centered upon the Sermon on the Mount, which he names one pretty remarkable precedent for field preaching. By April 2nd, only 2 days after his arrival, John does something he thought he never would. He says, quote, "At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile, and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in the ground adjoining to the city, to a crowd of about 3,000 people." So within 3 days of being in Bristol, John Wesley's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is vital versus what is vile is wholly overthrown. By his own accord, he shook the foundations of normativity, of acceptability, to follow the Spirit of God and meet people where they were, which in Bristol was literally in the fields. And it's here, in this moment of the story, that David Worthington so brilliantly told us that while John Wesley's heart was strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. It's in Bristol that he finds that true purpose, where he sees the place where he can intervene with the peoples of God. It's here that he willingly submits himself to being more vile for the love of God and of neighbor. Be more vile. Now, when we hear this word, we tend to think of dirty, disgusting, morally despicable. And this is probably what was going on in John Wesley's mind when he recalled this moment in his journal. He was very much still an Oxford Don, raised in the upper echelons of British society, highly educated, and while he didn't keep much money to his own name, I don't think anyone would dare think of John Wesley as poor. He was, despite his later objections in life, part of proper British society. He was the norm, an ordained clergy person. And as that and an Oxford Fellow, he represented the state, the church, and the educated elite. And yet, here he is, about to preach in a field in one of the poorest and dirtiest towns in the West. Now, at this moment, he proclaims the people in the fields of Bristol to be equivalent to those attending evensong at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Of course, for his socially and religiously conditioned mind, this was a vile act. And Wesley faced staunch criticism for his field preaching. Doors to various parishes across England were shut to him afterwards. He had already been pushing the boundaries with his theology, but now he stepped too far, literally, outside the walls of the church. While still in Bristol for that first trip, he received a letter from the local parish minister, which said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I see you, Wesley. I did not invite you here, and I do not welcome your radical preaching in my town." And it's in this calling out of his vileness that Wesley simply responds, "The world is my parish." Now, we often think of that phrase as a phrase of evangelism. John saw the world as his parish, and therefore no limits, no cultures, no faith, no persons are off limits for us to spread the love of God and faith in Jesus Christ. But that's not it at all. It's Wesley's defense of being vile. It's his way of saying, "I hear you, Reverend. I know you don't like what I'm doing, the people I'm reaching, and the message of God's radical love that I'm spreading, but it's not you that calls me, it's God. And this is where God is calling me." Again, this is not a statement of evangelism, but a defense of vitality. And John didn't stop with field preaching. He sanctioned the lay preaching of women. John ordained persons to serve sacraments when he himself had zero power to ordain. This means he broke apostolic succession in order to be more vile. And he wrote against slavery, calling it the most reprehensible thing on the earth at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. Time and time again, John was vile. And he thought he set up the emerging denomination in the United States to carry on this vile legacy, but it didn't. Our lack of vitality as United Methodists in 2022, in a moment of impending schism, we've lost our willingness, our gutsiness, our call, our submission to be more vile. We've lost that sense of vitality and instead have time and time again chosen vitality. But when did this happen? And when did we lose this Wesleyan way? Methodist historian Ken Rao would point to what he called the, quote, imperial approach to the episcopacy, evident with Francis Asbury's leadership. And while Asbury did make certain compromises to hold the new denomination together, I wouldn't necessarily place this as the spot where we lost our vitality. Other historians might say that we lost it when we began to build brick churches, when Methodism localized instead of following the movement of the Spirit. And others still might say that it's when we began catering to culture and engaged more in politics and less in evangelism. But given our current denominational moment, I want to look at the foundations of our past through the lens of schisms and mergers. If you went on a tour of the Archive Center today, you'll know that these have weighed heavily on mine and the minds of my staff as of late. I want to see if it's in these moments of institutional change that we lost our sense of vile self. Now, from a 30,000-foot view, one might argue that the fact that we've had so many splits and separations shows that Wesley's vileness did carry through. Those people called Methodist were still willing to call out institutional denominations to be better than the status quo, to change and to risk losing all for the love of God. Various schismatics along the way fought for lay rights, for checks on episcopal power, fought against slavery, and for free pews. And while many of these reformers chose to leave the Methodist Episcopal Church instead of staying and continuing to push the denomination towards vitality, often after they departed, there was a brief spark, a brief moment where hints of vileness emerged. For example, in 1842, abolitionist Methodists within the Methodist Episcopal Church were firmly pushing against the compromises made to allow Methodist members and clergy persons to carry on as enslavers. At the General Conference that year, those abolitionist Methodists walked out and formed the Wesleyan Methodist Church. This departure was the most significant up until that moment, and it affected the main branch of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Those few abolitionist Methodists who stayed became more ardent in their position. They reclaimed that vile spirit, that sense of calling out the status quo, to embody a spirit of sharing the love of God to all and for all. However, their position meant that the anti-abolitionist faction became more vocal too. And this results in 2 years after the Wesleyan Methodists leave, at the 1844 General Conference, we have the infamous denominational schism over slavery. So I don't think it's necessarily in our separations that we lost our vileness. So I want to posit that maybe it's in our coming back together. Maybe this is where we lost our vitality and chose to trade it for a false sense of vitality. Now, there were 4 significant mergers in the 20th century, and I want to explore some of these to see how Wesley's central calling of submitting to be more vile might have been lost. And as we weave through these mergers, I want you to keep in mind that those persons who represented the larger denominations usually won the day. These larger denominations also tended to represent a more traditional understanding, one that stressed vitality, membership, and power over dissent. The first one is in 1922, with the creation of the Evangelical Church, a merger of the United Evangelical Church and the Evangelical Association. Both of these traditions emerged from the preaching of Jacob Albright and were primarily concentrated in areas of Pennsylvania amongst the German reformers. By 1894, what had been known as the Evangelical Association split into 2 factions, mainly under the leadership of 2 bishops who disagreed with each other. Approximately 1/3 of the membership left and formed the United Evangelical Church. Those who left tended to be more progressive, preferred the English language over German, empowered the congregation within levels of the administration, and embraced new theologies and talked more about conversion than sanctification. Those who stayed within the Evangelical Association preferred still speaking German. They preferred a strong top-down executive leadership and holiness or sanctification as the primary emphases of salvation. Now, upon their rejoining in 1922, most of the polity of the Evangelical Association, the larger of the two, is upheld, except for one item, speaking German. 1939, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Protestants, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South merged to form the Methodist Church. This one blatantly chooses vitality over vitality. Methodist Protestants had departed the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1830, mainly over the rights of laypersons to have a voice and in support of a more abolitionist form of Methodism and to put checks on the power of bishops. Over the 100 years that they were apart from the Methodist Episcopal Church, they set term limits on the episcopacy. They empowered clergy to have a say in the appointment process. They began to ordain women in 1880 and empowered the laity to have a stronger voice in the denomination's administration. The Methodist Episcopal Church South was formed in 1844 at the General Conference, when Bishop James O. Andrew, who was serving in Georgia, announced that he had acquired enslaved persons through a marriage. Now that the question of enslavers being in good standing at the Episcopal level now that it had reached the Episcopal level, the matter was brought finally to a head. When it looked as if Bishop Andrews was going to be asked to resign, a committee voted to hold a separate general conference the next year in Louisville, Kentucky. Any persons who believed that slavery belonged within a Christian denomination were to go with that group. And by 1846, the Methodist Episcopal Church South had formed. Now, within the approximate 100 years that these three denominations existed as separate bodies, a lot changed. Not only within their own ranks, but within American society. Now, I don't have time to go into all of the details of the vast social, economic, technological, and demographic changes, but I want to highlight one development that directly impacts the 1939 merger. In the 1920s and 1930s, most of the major Protestant denominations split along what American religious historians call the modernist fundamentalist line. Modernism was based in the rise of German biblical criticism in the 1870s and had been fully incorporated into many American Methodist seminaries by the 1910s. This triggered a backlash, a more literal reading of Scripture, which emerged in full force by the 1920s as biblical fundamentalism. Now, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Lutherans all split along these lines in the first quarter of the 20th century. But Methodism didn't. Instead, it merged three denominations to form the Methodist Church. And this was not a rushed merger. In fact, it was over 60 years in the making, as the first overtures happened just down the road in Cape May, New Jersey in 1876. Over 6 decades, various Methodist leaders gathered together to discuss in what 2 ways the 2 denominations might come back together. It was believed that now that slavery was abolished, that the, quote, problem had been magically resolved, but that was not the case. Over the decades of separation, the MEC South became more and more adamant about racial segregation and white supremacy, while the MEC North continued on to begin new areas of legal and theological equity for women, for free blacks, and for formerly enslaved blacks. These theological differences were only then exacerbated by the rise of German biblical criticism, the beginning of the social gospel movement, the temperance movement, the beginning of Jim Crow, and the beginning and the rise of fundamentalism. And this is partly why these negotiations lasted 60 years. But what is truly striking is that in all of the negotiations, there was never a true theological discernment of race, of how religion and politics should and could relate to each other. And alongside these two denominations, which already cannot figure out how to talk to each other, the smaller denomination, the Methodist Protestants, jumped in the ring. And they gave up massive gains that they had won in their separation. When they came to the table in the 1930s, they had to give up women's ordination and term limits on bishops. Because they were the smaller denomination of the three, it was understood that this is the cost you pay to join the big dogs. So in 1939, the Methodist Church is formed, but not as a new radical witness in the world, but with a false sense of vitality. At a time when all other Protestant mainline denominations were dividing, Methodism wanted to show unity. It also wanted to be big, to have numbers, because numbers equate to dollars and dollars to power. And in that moment of that merger in 1939, the denominations that came together ceased any submission to be more vile. As their fix to the quote-unquote Negro question placed all Black Methodists into a segregated organizational structure called the Central Jurisdiction. White Methodists were organized by geographic region, Black Methodists were grouped by race. This compromise emerged as what was seen as the best move, the best way forward at a time, because those at the table knew that there was no discerning of race. But think about it. In the context of 1939 United States, what would have been the vile move? What would have shown an embracement of the Wesleyan love of God to boldly witness in the world? That would have been to fully integrate and to talk through the differences of biblical interpretation, to sit with one another and discern power. The vile move would have been for the largest Protestant denomination in the United States to take a stance towards full integration in the midst of Jim Crow. It would have even been more vile to continue to honor the ordination of women. But we didn't. Why? Because in that context, if you want to be big, if you want to have power, you have to conform. You have to bow to tradition and not challenge it. And we did it again in 1968. When the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church came together, they did so in a time of intense social change. The merger happened 1 month after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And those gathered didn't stop to breathe in God, to think about the message, the mission that they wanted to send in this moment of change. They did dissolve the central jurisdiction, but still didn't talk about race. Instead, they created a commission on religion and race and recognized the caucus group known as the Black Methodists for Church Renewal. Boxes checked, it was understood that these groups would discuss race. Racism went from a prominent fixture that could tangibly be fought to subsumed into the shadows of an increasingly centralized polity. And what would the United Methodist Church do with future differences, without settling the past tensions, the past disagreements, and the past theologies? The 1972 General Conference began the now 50-year argument over how we as United Methodists define sexuality. Specifically, in what ways we disempower those who do not identify as heterosexual. And many people argue that the changing of the conversation from race to sexuality was an intentional move, a distraction, so that the denomination would not have to, in 1972, finally talk about race. In other words, it was assumed that sexuality was a safer issue. In a turn of phrase that only Ken Rao could concoct, he describes these 20th century mergers as run by merger mafias. Persons who stressed areas of agreement and chose to ignore, even suppress difference. In these mergers, we lost our sense of radicalness, of deviancy, of vitality. We seem to have always chosen to compromise the love of God for the sake of union. Instead of submitting ourselves to be more vile, we have decided to be what society traditionally considers vital. If you listen to the Methodist blogosphere of the last 2 decades, certain caucus groups, such as the Good News Movement and the Wesleyan Covenant Association, have critiqued the United Methodist Church as no longer vital because we are losing membership within the United States. They falsely name this membership loss as beginning in 1968 with the creation of the United Methodist Church and what they call its catering to society. In actuality, the peak of Methodism in terms of membership in the United States was in 1932, and we've been in a relatively steady decline ever since. At the root of our various and numerous disagreements, I would argue that what we are debating is vitality versus vitality. Are we a vital church that has the most numbers, the biggest budget, and can therefore make the most fiscally measurable difference in the world? Or are we the church that dares to be vile, to recognize its own faults, to name its own harms, and dares to learn from those? Now, today we've memorialized one of the great Methodist historians of our day, Reverend Dr. Kenneth E. Rao. And while Ken was a prolific scholar, I know him most for his vast knowledge of primary documents. Much of this knowledge came from a love of the repositories that make up the United Methodist History and Archives Center here on Drew's campus. This week marks 40 years of this building being on our campus, housing 2 collections under one seamless roof. Ken was instrumental in convincing the Drew administration and the United Methodist Church that this was the place that these 2 entities could breathe, could work, could coalesce together. He lovingly referred to this building as the denomination's attic. And if we call it this, then Ken was an ultimate hoarder, ensuring diligently, dedicatedly, and deliberately that the combined collections were worth fighting for, worth keeping in one space. Now, no one probably to this day knows the documents and the space, the nooks and the crannies of the building like Ken. And this is where his legacy lies. It's in this literal foundation of our past. He knew primary sources like the back of his hand and made it his mission and legacy to have these resources together. When Ken laid the foundation of our denomination's repository, he was also a figure that was unafraid to shake that foundation, even at times to transgress normative, perfectly boxed in, perfectly filed away folders, perfectly labeled entities. One of my favorite aisles in the archival vaults is the row that houses Ken's papers. It's approximately 80 cubic feet and is full of unprocessed notes, lecture notes, research notes, drafts of articles, commentaries on other scholarly work, and other seemingly random bits of knowledge. Whenever I have a question about Methodist history and cannot find the answer in a book, I immediately go to Ken's aisle. And he was unapologetic in his calling out the dominant narrative within Methodist history as being too forgiving of itself, for being too white, too Western, too male, and too heteronormative. And he sought to correct that narrative. He's one of the first Methodist scholars to take a serious interest in women's history, in indigenous history, and in an honest assessment of the anti-Black racism present in our denominations. He's one of the first scholars to call for queer inclusion in our history. And he did all of this before it was front page or headline news, prompting an inquiry. The Methodist narrative has typically been written by white men and has featured white men. And Ken knew that as a white man, he was in a privileged position where if he chose to be more vile, people might listen. There are probably few historians in the world, maybe even few persons in the world, who might be okay with being called prophetically vile. But I think Ken might be one of them. When we think about this phrase, prophetically vile, it's actually a great phrase for Wesleyan methodology. I understand scholarship such as Ken's that is prophetically vile as using the past to forecast the future in order to challenge the norms that be, to upend the unexpected future, nay, even to queer what might plausibly occur. In one of my favorite chapters of Ken's, he asks and answers the question, how do caucuses contribute to connection? Now, he writes this chapter in the mid-1990s, and it begins with a reflection of the General Conference of 1972. Ken recalled having breakfast with a bishop who made an offhand comment about how all of the caucuses and all of the quotas and all of the politics was so very not Methodist. And this comment stuck with Ken, and he dwelled on it for a few decades, and then came to the conclusion that Methodism itself was born a caucus. It was born a caucus of missional renewal and reform within the Church of England. And while other historians deemed caucuses unworthy of serious study, Ken knew that it's in those grassroots movements where change begins, and through which Wesley's spirit of dissent lives on. Ken writes, few bishops from Asbury to those most recently elected have celebrated the presence of caucuses among us. Historians from Jesse Lee to William Warren Sweet wrote them out of the story. But in many ways, caucuses are a large part of our foundation, and if we don't acknowledge them, then we are ignoring the vileness of our past. For Ken, caucuses provide necessary balance to connectional authority. They enrich our understanding of the gospel, refocused our mission, and redistributed power. Ken understood the campaigns of caucuses as necessarily cantankerous and eccentric. So how can we think of Ken's scholarship as a continuation of John Wesley's submitting to be more vile? To go against the grain, to challenge the status quo, and create spaces where persons might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but the end goal is creating that space where God's love is truly felt by and for all. In the current moves, in the current calls to define what it means to #BUMC, do we dare to also be more vile? Now, this past Tuesday, GCAH, in partnership with the Drew Theological School, go to a couple more slides. Thank you. Hosted Keegan Osinski, who wrote Queering Wesley, Queering the Church. In these pages, she uses queer theory to reinterpret 10 of John Wesley's sermons. In the book discussion this past Tuesday, Keegan mentioned the various forms of criticism that she has received, from the standard homophobic critics to those who accuse her scholarship of being too anachronistic. And Keegan's response to claims of anachronism or accusations of anachronism was simply, duh. Of course my reading of Wesley in 2022 is going to be different from Wesley when he wrote 300 years ago to a very different place and a very different people. Her frankness when faced with criticism, her willingness to, in her own words, play with Wesley, with his sermons, is a perfect example of Wesleyan vitality. She writes, quote, ultimately, to queer Wesley and to queer the church is to open ourselves to the reality of multiplicity in ourselves and our communities. The unity that we project on faith, the church, God, and even our bodies is at its core a myth, a story that perpetuates the logic of the one, that in turn upholds the systems of oppression, repression, and violence that actually push us further from holiness. And she continues, what if we were to release this stranglehold we often call church unity, so that we could consider the church as a more capacious, breathable space? What if right thinking of ourselves, submission to the Holy Spirit, and tolerance of others and their journeys were what marked us as members of the church? In other words, what if we submitted to be more vile? Now today do we dare to submit ourselves to this Wesleyan act? Do we dare to risk our membership, our numbers, in order to reclaim vileness? To take God's message to the dirtiest towns, to the poorest centers, to places where even our siblings dare us not go? When was the last time you or I submitted yourself to be more vile for the love of God? When was the last time you or I made yourself uncomfortable in the name of God? These were the types of questions that were swirling around my head in the new room as I listened to David Worthington. When have I been willing to step outside my comfort zone, to go against social norms, to not only question authority, but outright disobey it because of a movement of the Holy Spirit? In Bristol, John Wesley's heart was set afire. To me, this is what we are missing today. We focus so much on strangely warming hearts, but that's a thing that's internal to me, myself, and my relationship with God. What's actually Wesleyan is what John did in Bristol, where he made himself uncomfortable for God. And it's in this blind trust of God that his heart was set afire, found a calling, it melted, it burned, and it yearned. It's in this movement outside of the church that true Orthodox Wesleyanism was born, in the fields of Bristol. So I leave you with a challenge. When you leave here, how will you dissent for the mission of God? And if I can give the United Methodist Church a challenge, it is to remember our roots, to go back to our vile foundations. Vitality hasn't gotten us too far. Maybe we should take a lesson from good old John and submit to be more vile. Thank you. I think we have time for questions if y'all have any.
We do have time for questions and answers, and we're going to come around with a microphone so that those who are listening online can also hear us. So go ahead and indicate your interest if you have a question or a comment at this time.
Dr. Boggan, great to see you, and thank you so much. I can't think of a more beautiful and open-hearted tribute to our friend and teacher and Rao than the one you've given. So thank you for that. I have a question about the verses, and I'm wondering if you might push that binary a bit and help us to think about how we can be both vile and vital at the same time. Is that a possibility? Could it be possible for us to move to vitality through our vileness in the ways in which you're inviting us to think?
I hope so. When you look at the past mergers, they're so focused on membership and on numbers. And that's where I think I get the verses from. And even when if you're like me and you read the Methodist blogosphere, it's really bad for the soul. But a lot of the criticism focuses so heavily on numbers and on membership. I do think we can be vital, and I had to take out a whole section of this on how we've been vital in the past. So I do think we've been vital in terms of our mission, but in order to become vital once again, I think we need to remember how to be vile and stop focusing on numbers.
What's your projection that we're going to be vile or vital or compromising in the upcoming debate about how we accept homosexuality?
That's the golden question, isn't it? I'm not quite sure. I like to think that, maybe after 8 years of breathing without having a general conference since 2016 and then the short one in 2019, that maybe we've had some space to let the Spirit of God enter and to move us in new ways. And sometimes moving in new ways means moving apart, but I don't know if that will happen. I think I and a few other probably Methodist historians have thought we were going to split at every general conference over the last 4 or 5, and it hasn't happened. So I'm not sure, but we'll see.
I just got an email from the Nebraska Conference Office saying the bishops are working hard to save our church.
That who's working hard? I'm sorry.
The bishops are working hard to save the United Methodist Church. I'm not sure what that means.
I know that bishops are working, and I'm working with a lot of bishops in this moment, to correct misinformation that's being put out there. There's a lot of it that's circulating, and so we've been working kind of hand in hand and side by side to ensure that information that's out there is accurate. And so that would be the only, without reading the full email, that's the only context I could offer.
They asked me to move to the front, so I'm going to do it. Ashley, thank you first for what I would say etymologically was just a villainous talk. For those of us who were more at home in the 13th century than the 18th century, what you've described is shockingly reminiscent of the early Franciscan movement. And so I'm wondering if you could place the vitality and vitality in a larger, let's say, Christian historical context.
Oh, I'm sure you could. I don't think we have another hour for me to trace all of this, but there's no doubt. I mean, I often, one of my favorite turns of phrases is that history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And so it definitely is. You see the cyclicalness of, I think that we have oftentimes spirits of vileness where we challenge the status quo, and then it's successful and we grow and we get focused on numbers, and then someone else challenges the status quo and our numbers get smaller, and then we're focused on numbers and on vitalness through numbers, and then it repeats, right? We then reclaim that tradition of vitality, and so on and so on. And so my hope in this moment is that maybe United Methodism will finally remember what it is to be vile.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. As United Methodists, we're encouraged to go into the world and make disciples for all nations. How do you measure vitality if you say the focus on the numbers? Because then how does that tie into the concept of making disciples for the whole nations if we don't look at the numbers? How then do you know if we are vital as a church?
Whew. I mean, this is kind of the big question, right? So in 2008, I think Meredith can correct me if she's still here. In 2008, the General Conference approved 4 areas of focus for the United Methodist Church to focus on. One of them was creating more vital congregations. And the metrics that were associated with that were exactly metrics of membership. So even the denomination isn't quite sure how to answer that. Since then, since 2008, they've tried to create new ways to measure vitalness, to measure vitality through mission work, through engagement with the poor, visiting the sick, all of the typical things that we think of when we think of Wesleyan social holiness, of going out and meeting neighbor where neighbor is. But that doesn't mean that doing vitality in that sense has a sense of vileness behind it, of challenging the status quo. It's a very fine line there, but yeah. No, we got one back.
Thank you so much. I was thinking as you were presenting this of like comparing it to queer history in the U.S. and how, the different things have impacted each other. But I was really struck by the idea that I believe you said when the UMC came together, the focus was on sexuality because it was easier than racism. So then I wonder now, if the UMC is focusing on sexuality, what would you say is being ignored? Why is this still an easier topic? I think that would create laughs in any other place that sexuality in the UMC is an easy topic, but I am struck by that dichotomy and what it can potentially mean for the greater atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think, in 1972, homosexuality was still labeled in what the American Psychiatric Annual as a deviancy. And so I think under that assumption, it was seen as an easier topic. I'm not trying to claim that it actually is. But underneath both the discussions of race, or the lack of discussions of race, and now our 50-year discussion of sexuality, I think lies questions of power and who is allowed to have religious authority, and how do we expand religious authority beyond cisgender, heterosexual white men, largely. So how do you look at a woman and see religious authority? How do you look at a black person and see religious authority? How do you look at someone who identifies as LGBTQIA+ and see religious authority? And so I think it's really that discussion that we aren't having. Some places are having it, but I think that's the discussion that needs to be had at the broader denominational level.
Thank you, Dr. Boggan, for your presentation. I'm coming from Reformed church background, so I read a lot from you, and I appreciate when you say that while it's not only the matter of questioning, but also being disobedient. Mm-hmm. And my question is how to become a vile, questioning and being disobedient without risking our vitality, our life. Because as a community that is being perpetrated, for example, to fight against the dominant culture or the power authority, it's in many ways risking our life. So how to do it without risking or even losing our life? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I would think that, one, I do think that the follow-through of being disobedient has to come after one contemplates vileness. So it would be very different if John Wesley just thought about field preaching and didn't do it. But he went out and did it. But he was also a very privileged person who did it. So I think that I never want anybody to put themselves knowingly at risk. But we have to look, this is where I'm going to put on my historian hat. If we look to our past, change wouldn't happen without persons being willing to put their bodies in danger. I mean, think of the marches of Martin Luther King Jr. Think of, if you've ever been to a general conference, the acts of biblical obedience that happen through the halls and through the plenary session of those. I mean, those are putting bodies physically in danger, but it's by that person's choice to do so. And it's in almost going back to kind of Wesley's blind trust that God had his back in this vileness, because he's following a movement of the Holy Spirit. So I would say do it with caution, and say a lot of prayer before, maybe. I think. Yeah.
I was thinking economics, which is, I think, the other word under membership.
Mhm.
And Wesley's really clear vision for the role of Methodists with ministry with and to the poor. And if we fail that, we have no business existing. I mean, that's a paraphrase. So when we look at the United States right now and the difference in economic status, I think class and economics is, again, what we will not talk about, and has bizarre, a secret in that conversation of what we are afraid we will lose. So, and like I said, he was very clear, if we're raised up for that work, and we can't do it, or won't do it, then we shouldn't be allowed to continue.
Thank you.
Actually, I was, if I may again, I was thinking about your way of getting us to think about vileness and vitality in the history of Christianity led me to think about where the vileness went when it left, quote, mainstream Methodism. And I was thinking, and this to Heather, to your point about economics, and to, in fact, race mixing. As we know, so much of that Methodist vitality went into early Pentecostalism, it seems to me. So if it left mainstream Methodism, it went at least in part into early Pentecostalism. I'm thinking about the ways in which at Azusa Street in Los Angeles in 1906, the ways in which those early Pentecostals really transgressed in every kind of way, right? In terms of worship ways, in terms of openness to women's voices, in terms of, quote, race mixing in a Jim Crow America. So I'm excited to see, to think with you about where that vitality went when it left mainstream Methodism. So I appreciate what you've said.
That's a great point, and you know, I don't know if Dina Ponte is still here, but we should co-teach a course on that. That would be wonderful. History of vitality in American religion.
We'll also get Jesse Mann.
There you go. All right. Any others?
Boggan, this was splendid, and
Thank you.
I can only keep reviling with everyone else here. I've been here probably, I think, longer than anyone in the room here, unless Art Presley is hiding out here. I've been at Drew longer, so well over 30 years. And Drew's theological school certainly been committed to vileness the whole time, though you're naming it brilliantly for us. Thank you. But it's been a real status quo of vileness in this tradition that I've been part of, and I'm proud of that. I'm glad of that. I hope I've contributed to this vileness and whatever vitality it does allow. There's certainly a lot of liveliness in it. But I guess because it sort of has been the status quo of this theological school all this time, we've survived it. But I do wonder about the temptations also of a kind of self-insulation in that vileness, not necessarily what's meant by identity politics or identitarianisms of one kind or another, but, you know, a kind of sense of becoming a protected isle of progressivism, you know, a little island of islands, perhaps an archipelago, because we all have our distinctness. But I worry about that too, and I worry that vileness versus vitality could be a bit of an excuse for not taking the unpleasant risks of reaching out, you know, to those we really think are vile, you know, who are more conservative than we are. And, I avoid it like the plague. And I found a very vital United Methodist Church that's booming and growing and is totally leftist and vile. So I'm able to avoid it and feel relatively healthy in the process. But I have a bit of a sense of bad faith all the time as well, if that question makes sense. Like, how do we avoid that temptation?
And I think that's where we see kind of, when Ken wrote that article, it was in the mid-1990s, and he had tallied up about 20 caucuses already in the mid-90s. We've doubled, if not tripled, if not quadrupled, the number of caucuses in the United Methodist Church. And I think some of what you're getting at, how vitality can lead to kind of creating bubbles, is what we've seen it do. When you look at the history, especially the recent history of caucusing in the UMC. And when you examine those caucuses, they do. They butt heads. They do not like to interact, usually. And so, but I think that sometimes when the bubbles, I'm sorry, I now have a 2-year-old, so I'm just picturing all these bubbles. When the bubbles, you know, like come together and form that amalgamous, like bubble, giant bubble, if all our bubbles could just bubble together, maybe we could actually influence the denomination to take up these. And I mean, a lot of this talk is very much at the denominational level, and you're exactly right that there are congregations that are doing the vile work. There are seminaries like Drew that do the vile work, and so it can be hard when, and I, you know, was part of the Drew bubble. It can be hard to recognize outside of your own bubble, and to expand beyond that and reach beyond that. But it's also is necessary.
I'm going to jump in, I guess, briefly here in the place of Dr. Aponte, who is actually in another room in the building online for the In La Luca online streaming presentation through the rest of the day. I'm Rob Seasongood, the Associate Dean of Vileness at the Theological School here. And I would love to hear more of this conversation, but conscious of the hour, I think we should all give thanks for this wonderful presentation from Dr. Boggan. And those who are here get to enjoy a little bit of snack and refreshment together. Those who are online get the benefit of running off to go catch the rest of our programming for today immediately. But thank you very much for your time and your presentation and for being vile.
Thank y'all.